Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology, From the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Well, welcome to the program. My name is Dr. George Sparks, and this is Biblical Archaeology From the Ground Down. Today, I got with me a very special guest. His name is Professor Kent Dark. At this time, I'm going to read his biography. Professor Kent Dark is an archaeologist and historian specializing in the first millennium AD, especially early Christianity, urbanism, and late antiquities. After a PhD in archaeology and history from the University of Cambridge, he taught at the University of Oxford and Cambridge before moving to the University of Reading, where he became a professor of archaeology and history. Leaving Reading in 2021, he was a visiting professor at the University of Navarra. Is that right?
Navarra. Also, it's Reading, not Reading.
Reading.
Like noted.
Okay, good. Thank you. Before coming to King's College in 2022. Professor Dark has been awarded honorary professional titles from 4 overseas universities and written over 100 academic publications, including 14 books, in addition to works for the wider public. He has directed many archaeological excavations and surveys in Europe and in the Middle East, including the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Nazareth, and on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He is also Professor Kent Dark, a fellow of the Society of Antiquities of London, the Societies of Antiquities of Scotland, the Royal Historical Society, and the Royal Anthropological Institute, and a member of the Royal Institute of the International Affairs and the Royal Society of Antiquities of Ireland. He is the only person ever elected to all these learned societies. Today, we're going to be looking at his book, Archaeology of Jesus of Nazareth, and the excavation of an ancient residence that he uncovered or excavated in Nazareth. Today, welcome, Professor, to the program. Love to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I think it's very interesting that you've been over in Nazareth since 2006. Is that correct? When you started the program?
I started working the Nazareth area in 2004, in central Nazareth in 2006. That was originally intended to be a study of the emergence of a late Roman and Byzantine period, 5th to 7th century period, pilgrimage site, Christian pilgrimage site, against its Roman landscape. In other words, we would see how a pilgrimage site actually came to be in a landscape that was a rural landscape, probably dominated by non-Christian populations, in its case, probably a Jewish population, but not a Christian population anyway. And we would understand better, we thought, how pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land came into existence in the first place. However, what we found was something we weren't looking for, which was a lot of evidence of the 1st century AD. Though that was hugely earlier than the stuff we thought we'd be finding, when it's Nazareth and you're finding a lot of 1st century material, obviously it's extremely interesting. And turned our attention as a team. You know, I was the director of the team, but in a sense, I turned our attention to studying the early Roman, the 1st and 2nd century periods, as well as the later Roman and Byzantine periods. And that's how I came to work on Nazareth. People often think that I went there for the 1st century aspects. Ironically, the archaeologists who've talked about or done some archaeological work in first century Nazareth, haven't found very much, but we, not intending to do that, found really a lot. And I'll be able to talk about this for your viewers in the next hour or so.
Oh, that'd be lovely. So you went there for observance of the Byzantine period and Roman period. How did you get interested or motivated towards first century tomb and residential complex that was associated with, it was a church, or is the Sisters of Zion, the Sisters of Nazareth?
What happened was we started off doing an archaeological survey of the area around modern Nazareth. In fact, the area within a valley between modern Nazareth and the Roman town of Sepphoris, which is, let's say, about 5 miles to the north. It's not exactly, but let's say. The valley is today, as it's always been, an agricultural landscape. So we could survey, as archaeologists, very easily without the encumbrance of a modern city or a lot of modern houses. And what we found was a densely packed Byzantine, but also Roman landscape that had originated at the start of the first century, maybe just a bit before, and that had come right the way through, so to speak, until the Byzantine period, till the 7th century. That survey was between 2004, 2006. Obviously, having examined the hinterland of Roman and Byzantine Nazareth and found all this settlement, all these small farms, which weren't known about before in the valley, this drew attention to how little archaeologists knew in 2006 about the Roman settlement of Nazareth. There had been some work, but mostly a long time ago, and mostly not by professional archaeologists, and never a study that brought together the hinterland of the settlement and the settlement of Nazareth itself. Just to finish off this piece, I decided to try to find a site which we could excavate in central Nazareth to understand better what was happening in the Roman period settlement of Nazareth, how big it was, how rich it was, what sort of people lived there, and so on. But that wasn't easy because it had the modern city of Nazareth built over it. It still has. By the end of about a week of looking for a suitable site to excavate, I was absolutely despairing for ever being able to find somewhere to excavate in central Nazareth. And that's when, as I say at greater length in the book, I came across an old excavation done for us, as it were. The soil had already been removed, but the material that had been found had never been published. And there were walls, there were rock-cut features, there were amazing finds, never published. And this was literally in a cellar under the modern convent of the Sisters of Nazareth. And the Sisters of Nazareth site was then, from 2006 onward, what the project really focused on. But the beauty of that was, whereas an excavation in the centre of Nazareth would have been difficult to get permission for, would have been difficult to actually conduct, and extremely expensive, all the earth-moving work or that sort of thing had already been done for us at the Sisters of Nazareth. And past records, not made by archaeologists, mostly made by the nuns themselves back in the 19th and early 20th century, enabled us to get enough information when we re-examined the actual physical site, the remains that they'd excavated, to reconstruct, as it were, the sequence of what they found, the date of what they found, and what it was that they found. And that's when the Sisters of Nazareth site gets really interesting.
That is fantastic. That this all kind of happened suddenly. To do such a project like that, how many permits would you have to have? One from the church, because you're under a church structure, and then also the authority of Israel.
Well, yeah, essentially two permits. A license from the State of Israel, which you get if you're a professional archaeologist like myself, through the Israel Antiquities Authority. And they were very, very helpful. I have to say, they were extremely helpful. And they were completely, fair and reasonable, and gave us a permit extremely quickly. And then a permit, that was the first of the two, and then a permit from the Order of the Sisters of Nazareth. Now, that's not from the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth. The Sisters of Nazareth, the Order of the Sisters of Nazareth that is in Nazareth, is a French-speaking order based in Paris. They're not Palestinian nuns or some local nuns. They are essentially European nuns, mostly French and some other European nationalities. And there are some, because that order has convents all over the world, there are some nuns in the Sisters of Nazareth order who are, for example, Indian, from outside Europe anyway. So the point is, we had to apply to the convent, yes, and get the approval of the superior, what in other convents might have been called the Mother Superior, but they don't call their head Mother Superior, Sisters of Nazareth, they just say the Superior. And she had to apply for us to the head of the Order of the Sisters of Nazareth in Paris. And at this point, it's worth mentioning that there are two sets of nuns, two orders called the Sisters of Nazareth. The ones I've worked with, which are French-speaking and based in Paris, and do huge amounts of charitable work, for example, in the Middle East. And there's another Sisters of Nazareth, which is English-speaking, not based in France, and which unfortunately has been involved in some really pretty serious scandals, I understand. I don't know anything really about them, except that the Sisters of Nazareth I worked with was not that order. And whenever I speak these days, I'd just like to make that clear, because the nuns I worked with in Nazareth were extremely admirable people. You couldn't hope for nicer people. And in fact, one of my archaeological staff, who was a secular archaeological team, people from different faiths and no faith, this chap is, I think, describe himself as an agnostic. And he said, oh, if everybody was like the Sisters of Nazareth, everybody would be if all Christians were like the Sisters of Nazareth, everybody would be a Christian. Okay. Anyway, they were exemplary, and their order asked reasonable questions, Was I going to knock the convent down? Was it going to cost them anything? Was it going to, bring them into ill repute? No. And once they were satisfied of that, and that I was a bona fide archaeologist, they were absolutely happy to grant permission. And once they'd done that, I had the two permits. I was completely legal, as it were, and I could bring a team over from Britain. We had a British team. We were not an international team. I could bring a team, mostly of professional archaeologists, some other people, and conduct this archaeological fieldwork, which was the new bit, the fresh bit of analysing the site along with the old bit, as it were, of looking at all the records that previous investigators of the site, mostly the nuns, had provided for us. And that turned out to be a huge job itself. I'd not thought that there'd be very many records made by the nuns when they were excavating in the 19th century, but I was very, very wrong. I can remember vividly being shown into the convent's archive room, which fortunately had a photocopier which we could use. And this was a substantial room, not huge, but big enough, full of files and shelves of these records and rolls of drawings made by the previous investigators of the Sisters of Nazareth site, mostly, as I say, the nuns themselves. And indeed, the site was first excavated. It was found and first excavated by the then superior of the convent when the convent was established in Nazareth in the middle of the 19th century. And she, having instigated an excavation, having directed an excavation, and having mostly the staff of her nuns on an excavation, really holds quite an important place in the history of archaeological fieldwork, because I think she is at least one of the first women to do that at all. That was a remarkable figure in itself. Marie Giraud, she's called. At that time, the sisters did call their superior mother, and so she's Mère Marie Giraud.
That is fascinating, though. Along with the records, did they have artifacts?
Oh,
those artifacts, of course, will be dated, right? So
yeah, exactly. There was the site there, which they'd carefully preserved. I mean, again, it's a remarkable story. These nuns, it's not a large or especially wealthy convent. The nuns had actually realized that they'd found massively important things and had a shelter built over the remains that they'd excavated. So even more remarkable than that, this shelter had to be partly under the actual convent. So it's in the front cloister of the convent. It's a freestanding building. Then under one of the wings, one of the sides of the cloister, and then it goes back into the garden of the convent. It's so large. When I first went to the site, I was told, oh, they have a cellar in which they've got various things. I thought it would be like a house cellar. This is a huge thing. It's not so much a cellar, it's an underground gallery of archaeological material. And to have the foresight to do that when they did, when the convent was being built in the very early years of the 20th century, was an amazing thing. There aren't many excavations in Europe or the Middle East, or for that matter, the United States, that were preserved in that way at that time. Really very, very few. So they were very innovative. They thought about what they were doing. And for their time, they recorded what they were doing extremely well. And as part of that, they established their own museum, purpose-built in the convent when they rebuilt it in the early 20th century, to hold the finds they'd made during these excavations. And by that time, they'd been excavating for nearly half a century, so they'd got a load of material. But unfortunately, the story of the museum is not quite as happy as the story of the site in general, because, first of all, the nuns were so kindly that when pilgrims came to Nazareth and they visited the convent, which has always provided accommodation for people, particularly women travellers visiting Nazareth, they sometimes would give people visiting the site an artifact to take away with them. They don't do it now, but and so they lost a lot of material that way. Then they also lost a lot of material in the First World War, when Nazareth was occupied by the Turkish army. The Turkish army was actually quite respectful towards the Sisters of Nazareth site and to Sisters of Nazareth themselves. But unfortunately, there was some theft from the museum. Not only was there theft from the museum, but ironically, some of the most important objects in the museum were given at the start of both world wars, and you'd have thought they'd have learnt a lesson after the first one, but given to friendly people to keep safe in their private homes. In the First War, this was local people, and most of the stuff was returned. In the Second World War, it was sent to France, and none of the stuff was returned. We don't know, literally, we don't know where it is. One of these days, I'm hoping someone will write to me from France and say, you know, the best finds from a 19th century Sisters of Nazareth site, well, they're stacked in crates in my basement. Do you want to come and have a look at them? But unfortunately, they haven't so far. Do they still exist? I don't know. Have they been dispersed? That's possible. Have they been destroyed in the Second World War? That is also possible. Where I think they went, specifically, but don't know, is Marseille in the south of France. Because at that time, a Jesuit Catholic priest, a man called Henri Senez, was very involved in trying to help the Sisters of Nazareth, the nuns, record what they'd found. And Senez went on to do his own excavations at the site. He never published anything. I mean, well, if you don't count a couple of tourist pamphlets, he never published anything on it. But he did do a lot of unpublished work on it. Now, he was from Marseille, from I think a very established family in Marseille. I suspect when they said they sent, well, most of the best finds, as they understood them then, to France for safekeeping at the start of World War II, I suspect that Senez organised this and had them sent to Marseille. So that's what's happened to the museum. It's been emptied of many of the things that we read about in earlier accounts of the excavation that the nuns wrote and didn't publish. It's also been stolen from during the Turkish occupation, but also afterwards they've had material stolen from them, and unfortunately they were also the victim of a couple of scams early on in the interwar period, when people who claimed to be Catholic clergy turned up at the convent and said, "Oh, you've got lots of gold coins. Do you know, I can get them identified for you if you let me take them back to Rome," or that sort of thing. And then they just disappeared. In one case, we have an actual follow-up to that, in which the superior became very suspicious of a couple of men who purported to be quite senior Catholic clergy and had taken a lot of things, including lots of coins, away. And she checked back in Rome, and they turned out not to have, in the Vatican, I suppose it was, they turned out not to have any record of them being Catholic clergy at all. And so it seems that was another kind of scam. So anyway, the upshot of all this, as we say, is that the museum is not as helpful as it might be to the modern archaeologist. And worse still, when the objects were kept in the museum, two things also happened. lots of them were mixed up. They often grouped objects with similar kinds of things without recording where they actually came from on the site, which is not what you want as an archaeologist. And second, material from other places in Nazareth, other places in Israel, as it now is, were incorporated in the Sisters of Nazareth Museum. Unfortunately, not all of those things were marked or labelled as from other places. So we've not got a load of stuff that we know they found. We've got a museum in which we have some of the stuff that we know they found, but it's all mixed up. And we have a museum which unfortunately has things from elsewhere mixed in with the Sisters of Nazareth finds. So sorting that lot out and trying to make sense of it and trying to find if we could identify any material, any objects that came from specific places in the Sisters of Nazareth site was a major undertaking. And really, that was as big a part of the project as analysing the old records or doing the new archaeological recording survey of the site.
So we can't say that there was in situ then.
Well, there's a lot of material in situ. There are a lot of walls. There are a lot of archaeological features that can be dated that were in situ.
All right.
But the finds, the objects, the portable objects, are not in situ. I mean, well,
Right.
doubtless many of them still are on the site itself. But this is a site which it would be extremely difficult to
Right, I understand.
It would probably be ethically, as an archaeologist, be ethically problematical to excavate. Generally, with archaeology, because archaeological methods have improved so much, decade on decade, through the history of archaeology, if something doesn't need doing now and is being carefully looked after, it's better to leave it for a future generation of archaeologists. People, often say to me, would you like to see new excavations done at the Sisters of Nazareth site? And unless something was actually going to be destroyed, for example, through building work, I absolutely would not. I think it's been quite well preserved. Maybe it would benefit from a bit more funding for being towards the preservation of what's there, but we don't need more excavation at the site. We need a better strategy of preserving, or more funding anyway, for preserving what's there and is already known, because what they have got at the Sisters of Nazareth site is some very, very important evidence. Just how important depends upon how far you're prepared to go in the interpretation. At minimum, it's an internationally important archaeological site. At maximum, it would be, well, several people have described it as one of the most important archaeological sites ever discovered. I would tend towards the minimum, but myself, but on the other hand, it depends how you interpret it. And some people have a much more robust, well, not robust is not the word, punchy interpretation of it than I do.
People are going to ask me, I can hear it coming, can it be visited? Can tourists come and visit that site? Or do you have to call ahead of time with reservation, or how can that be done?
Yeah, it is not open to the public. It's under a working convent. By definition, a closed place with nuns who pray. But you can, if you're an individual or very small group, you can phone ahead and ask them if you could have permission to visit it. If you do that, be prepared for the answer to be no. But they do let some people visit it. It depends upon what they're doing in the convent at the time, because you don't get to go down there without being shown around it by one of the nuns. There's no self-guided dimension to the Sisters of Nazareth cellar. You go down there, it's unlocked, it's locked within a locked building, within a locked convent. You go down there with one of the nuns and she explains what's there. That can be done. And I know people who've done that. It's not a site of mass tourism.
Especially with the history that you just told me about, the tragedy of the museum and all that. Another question I can hear coming is that in the biblical narrative, it mentions Jesus and his family, I don't know about the sisters, but at least the men, being tectons.
Yeah.
Which in the Greek means artificer, which is more like your gainful employment isn't making chairs and tables. It'd be more like working in stone.
It's but working in the construction industry, basically, to be a tecton.
Mm-hmm. Have you found evidence for that? Like any type of stone working around? Go ahead.
Well, whoever built the Sisters of Nazareth house, there is a first century house under the Sisters of Nazareth site. It's quite well dated. It's very much there, as we say. You can see it very clearly. Whoever built that house did know a lot about the properties of the local stone. It's very cleverly worked, or at least one room of it, very cleverly worked from a natural cave, so that the natural cave's roof supports the stairway, the rock-cut stairway, up to an upper floor level or a roof level. It's now impossible to say which was in turn supported, at least partly, by the flattened roof of the cave. So somebody knew a lot about how you would work stone to achieve that effect. Would it have been made by someone who might well have been called in Greek a tecton? Absolutely. Does that mean that it was made by St. Joseph or Jesus or one of Jesus's brothers? We don't know. I mean, we can't. There's no way archaeology can tell you that.
That's fair. Because not too far away, of course, is the Zipporah. That's a huge city. So I can imagine for gainful employment, you can go from Nazareth to Zipporah and have quite an income.
Well, strangely enough, it looks as if that wouldn't have been what happened. People have speculated on that for almost a century, but Sepphoris, Zipporah, Sepphoris is its English name, is absolutely a major Roman town in the 2nd century. But in the 1st century, it was a much smaller place than it was in the 2nd century. When you go there now, or if you look at it on the internet, you see really impressive Roman buildings and stuff, and mosaics, which date from that 2nd century and later town. But it was a much smaller, though urban, place in the 1st century, we think. Even so, I might have thought, that people as close to it as Nazareth would have walked across the valley and gone to work in Sepphoris. That does seem, on the face of it, an obvious thing to do. Unfortunately, the archaeological evidence suggests that's not the case. Not only is there not a road across that valley, not a Roman road or any kind of constructed trackway, so far as we can see, but more importantly, the farms and tiny villages, hamlets really, which we found archaeologically in my 2004 to 2006 archaeological survey excuse me, survey of the valley, and there are a lot of them, differ from the Sepphoris side of the valley to the Nazareth side of the valley. It's almost like you've got a straight line drawn along the middle of this quite broad agricultural valley. And on the Sepphoris side, everything's like you'd expect anywhere in the Roman Empire. The small settlements, the farms, maybe small villages in the valley have objects that are derived from Roman provincial culture, let's say. They're not specifically Jewish, they're not specifically anything culturally. They're part of, well, apart from Roman provincial culture, which was mixed and multicultural, and is known across the Roman Empire. It's in regional and local variants, just like cultures are today, but it is a very multicultural world of the Roman provinces. Right, now go to the Nazareth side of the valley. It's a completely different cultural world. None of the stuff manufactured by anybody who wasn't a Jew is found there. On all these sites, nothing of non-Jewish manufacture is found. Same in Nazareth. Down the center of the valley, we've got a division uniquely in the Roman Empire that abrupt between people who are buying into Roman provincial culture and its multiculturalism, and people who are being very conservative about their religious Judaism. And the obvious mechanism, if you can use that word for this, is that the people on the Nazareth side of the valley are adhering to a much stricter version of the Jewish religious laws of the first century than the people on the Sepphoris side.
Got it.
And therefore, a tecton from Nazareth is not likely to have been going to Sepphoris for work. They're likely to have been working either in Nazareth itself or among the Jewish farms and villages or elsewhere in Jewish communities, because they're keeping themselves separate from the Roman urban culture of Sepphoris, and presumably they're keeping themselves separate from Roman culture generally. And that's really fascinating. We didn't know that before. No one knew that before our archaeological work in the valley in 2004 to 2006. And it's really actually important, not just for this kind of discussion, but also for the archaeology of the Roman Empire. Because in the broader archaeology of the Roman Empire over the last 10 or 20 years, really, a major theme has been to what extent local people showed resistance, not necessarily violent resistance, but passive resistance of a non-violent character as well to the forces of what used to be called Romanization, of incorporation in Roman culture. People weren't necessarily buying into the whole Roman thing, but they were being affected by Roman materialism, really, and commercialism. The Roman, well, we talk about it as the Roman consumer society. So they were buying into that. And it's really exceptionally rare to have such a clear-cut example of local resistance to those economic and cultural forces, which were so powerful across the whole of the Roman world. So,
Professor, thank you for that. That's the first time I heard that explained that the people of Nazareth, separate from the Roman culture that was going on in Zippori. I never heard that before. I always heard that Jesus and family as Tectons would have ventured over, but since we don't see that combination of artifacts or what you're explaining in that Nazarene environment, then they were tried to seclude themselves. That's wow. That's a wow to me. I never heard it before.
Well,
No, but other people.
it's
Yeah.
it's a fascinating pattern. I mean, it's not a pattern we get elsewhere. You know, it is very unusual. I think it would probably be a pattern that one would get if one conducted the same sort of archaeological survey in different parts of Israel, as you know, the modern state of Israel. I think that would be something that we would get more commonly. But archaeological survey, as opposed to archaeological excavation, has tended not to use the full range of survey methods we would use, for example, in Northwest Europe, investigating Roman landscapes, when investigating Middle Eastern landscapes, not just in Israel, but anywhere in that part of the world. So there have been studies that have used those methods. I'm not saying this was methodologically unique, but I think if those methods were used much more widely, we would get more evidence like that. But it's certainly a very, very clear-cut pattern in the valley separating Sepphoris to the north, Nazareth to the south. And of course, south of Nazareth, you might be saying, why do I focus on the valley north of Nazareth? There is a massive natural cliff, really, a natural rock scarp that really makes movement, or at least made before the modern roads were constructed, movement south of Nazareth much more difficult for local farmers than farming the valley north of Nazareth, which anyway is very agriculturally rich in, you know, soil and water and climate. Nazareth is amid a really good region for agriculture within the Galilee, and Galilee was the most agriculturally rich area of the Roman province that it was within. So it was a good place to be if you're a farmer, and it's unsurprising in that respect that we've got so many of these little farms. They must have been able to make not just a subsistence existence, but probably a much more profitable, if you want, existence. And that's presumably why these small farms we find in the valley have manufactured objects which were not manufactured on the sites themselves. They've been acquired by commercial means. So they've gone somewhere, I presume, maybe the merchants came to them, but I think probably they've gone somewhere, like maybe if it's a bigger village than the other villages, Nazareth, where at least periodically and in an informal way, you can buy these different things. I say buy, maybe not with coins. We don't have any early Roman coins from most of these sites. In fact, early Roman coins almost don't exist within Nazareth. There are a few possible old finds of early Roman coins, and there's one modern find of a coin of Claudius within the ancient settlement of Nazareth. So that's obviously after the time of Jesus.
44 around the
yeah. Claudius was the guy who was the emperor who invaded Britain. So in AD 43, that will give you a rough idea.
That's to me fascinating because my mind is going around as you're telling me this. To me, new information. The way you talked about the seclusion of the people of Nazareth, possibly because of their Jewish law and obedience
Yeah.
to it, almost reflects to me, I'm just saying, in a way, the Essenes, an established type of community that keeps themselves away from other elements, you could say, that they didn't approve of.
There's nothing actually specifically Essene about anything we found in or around Nazareth.
Okay.
It'd be fascinating to find something Essene from Nazareth or its area, absolutely. But there isn't actually evidence of that. What I think you're seeing is not an Essene community, but a community that is affected by the same kind of cultural world of variations within Judaism and variations between less strict and stricter versions of Jewish communities, and also variations between those Jews who wish to engage with the Roman world and those who wish to stand back from it. And it's fascinating, of course, that Jesus would grow up in a community of people who were emphasizing their Jewish religious identity. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the one thing that the Gospels tell us, apart from working and being a child, tell us Jesus actually did in Nazareth was attend the synagogue, whatever a synagogue means in first century Nazareth. It could be a building. It could be just an assembly of the people. They could, for all I know, be sitting on a rock or in somebody's house. The fact of the matter is, the only thing we're told about Jesus in Nazareth specifically involves a religious assembly. So I think that is consistent with, it's not evidence for exactly, but it's consistent with the strongly Jewish religious identity of Nazareth in the early first century. And that's an important thing to know, because of course people have, and I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm an archaeologist, but people have thought about, experimented with ideas, if you like, of aspects of Roman or Greek philosophy or culture affecting Jesus's outlook in his early years. We can't say that isn't possible within the academic terms that we're addressing the Nazareth question in. We can say it's extremely unlikely. It doesn't strike me as a sort of place where you're going to come across classical Greek philosophy or, for that matter, Roman literature. It's the sort of place where you're going to come across Jewish religious law, Jewish Bible, possibly, ideas coming out of the various divisions within Judaism at the time, but maybe not even that, because of course it's a pretty remote rural community that it's not on the road to anywhere. It's quite remote, and it's in Galilee, which is a long way from Jerusalem. Its archaeology does have a little bit of linkage to Judea, actually. The archaeology of the part of the Galilee, which Nazareth is within, does have some suggestion that people have come from the south in previous generations to settle there, that there's some ongoing relationship. So, as I say, I'm not involved in biblical studies, but if you wanted to link the Gospels with the archaeology of Nazareth, it would be possible to say it's the kind of place that someone who had been born in Bethlehem could have moved to. They could have had family links further south. They could also have been so strongly committed to their Jewish faith that they would go to Jerusalem, as the Gospels talk about Jesus going with Mary and Joseph to Jerusalem. It's all really consistent with the Gospel story, but I can't say, it proves any of it. It just is consistent with it. So often I'm asked, have you found anything that disproves the Bible? No. Have you found anything that proves it? Absolutely. Well, no. We would be extraordinarily unlikely to find something with an inscription or a piece of graffiti, which is what it would need to actually mention Jesus in an identifiable way. It's really beyond the bounds of archaeological credibility that such a find would be made. But it's conceivable, but I wouldn't expect it anytime soon. Here on the first slide, we see the cover of my recent book, Archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth. That book is published internationally. I don't know how much it will be in the United States. It's £25 in the UK. The book is an attempt to present to a general audience, a non-specialist audience, what my Nazareth project actually found. It takes the reader through from the work we did in the valley. You can see here the valley between Sepphoris and Nazareth that I've just been talking about. Then on to Nazareth itself, which we see here, David Roberts' famous early 19th century painting of Nazareth, which is really, so far as one can tell, quite accurate in its depiction of the place, although slightly romanticized, including figures and pretty landscape. Roberts' picture of Nazareth is notable for it including the Wadi or Vadi, the seasonal river valley that once ran through the centre of Nazareth. And you can see it here in this picture with a couple of bridges going across it in the 19th century. On the right-hand side, as you look at the picture, you can see the Church of the Annunciation, not the present one, but the building that was there before the current Church of the Annunciation. Behind it, away behind it, the only mosque that was in Nazareth in Robert's time, the so-called White Mosque. On the left of that picture, you can see a group of white buildings which are roughly where the Sisters of Nazareth site is today. My next slide shows on the left the Church of the Annunciation as in its modern form, and on the right an image of the sort of constructions, rock-cut artificial caves underneath the Church of the Annunciation, and these represent features from the Roman period that were excavated by the Franciscans who built the Church of the Annunciation in its modern form when the church was being built in the later 20th century. And they were, for a long time, the best evidence that had been published of settlement on the site of modern Nazareth in the first century. Coming on to the quarrying that we found in the valley, we didn't just find evidence of settlements, we found evidence of quarrying dating from the Roman and probably Byzantine periods. Here is an example. You can see a half quarried out stone block on the right and what look like indentations or steps where other quarried blocks have already been removed from these Roman quarries. There were a pair of clusters of Roman quarries in the valley, one near Sepphoris, as you'd expect. People had to quarry the stone to build the town, and one nearer Nazareth, which was unexpected because it was thought to be a very small place. And why would one be quarrying stone to build houses within what was a very small settlement. The cluster of quarries around Nazareth probably indicates one of two things: either that the settlement of Nazareth was itself more substantial than archaeologists have been inclined to believe, or more likely that actually the people in Nazareth were engaging in commercial quarrying, and those quarried blocks being taken off, presumably by cart or sled, to different settlements for use. This raises the possibility that Nazareth was itself a type of settlement we know from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, for example, in Roman Egypt, called by modern archaeologists a quarry settlement. These are primarily agricultural villages which nonetheless supplement their agricultural income by small-scale quarrying. If this was true, that Nazareth was a quarry settlement, it would lend considerable strength to the idea that it was the sort of place that one might have found a tecton in the sense of the tecton in the Gospels. Coming to the Sisters of Nazareth site, you can see here a picture of a general view of the Sisters of Nazareth first century house. Not all the walls that are in the picture are themselves from the first century, but the rock-cut wall on the left and straight ahead of you, and the doorway, also rock-cut, are features of the first century house. And the scale, which is in 10-centimetre intervals, the red and white scale, is standing on the original floor of that house. Unfortunately, previous excavators of the Sisters of Nazareth site dug away most of the floor. In fact, the only patch of it that remains is right in front of that doorway you can see there. There were other rock-cut walls on the site, but some of them couldn't be recognised by earlier investigators of the site because they were the sort of features that archaeology didn't really have the capability to recognise until the last few decades. This is an example in the next slide of a rock-cut wall at the top of the slide with what is called by archaeologists wall tumble, basically the fallen remains of a dry stone, a stone with a wall without mortared stone, but nonetheless built of stone, in the foreground of the picture. So you have evidence of a rock-cut wall, a rock-cut base of the wall with dry stone construction above that. And that was something that we found for the first time on one side of the much better preserved house that you've seen. And in my final slide, you can see the floor, the one preserved piece of the floor that survived the earlier excavations at the site. These were excavations by Henri Sénez in the 1940s, and what I think happened was this piece of floor was preserved simply because that was where the workman was standing when he dug out the rest of the floor. And so we have a fortuitous survival here of a floor built out of very compacted, crushed up limestone. The Nazareth as a whole, as you could see from that picture of the quarry, is built on a white limestone, which is effectively in two layers, two geological layers, not archaeological layers, one of which is quite soft and the other is very hard, and they can obviously be used in different ways for construction purposes, both in the past and present. And here we see a crushed limestone floor, looking, and it would have looked, really quite like it was a mortared floor. And that would have been white when it was originally laid, and the house walls would have been internally plastered with white plaster. So it would have been quite a bright interior, although obviously it would have been constructed from carving back the rock, the natural rock, rather than mostly building up walls, although there are some built elements apparently in the first century house at the Sisters of Nazareth. So you've got a house which would have been quite sturdy. It would have been quite cool in summer, which was probably just as well in Galilee, and it would have been easy to keep warm and waterproof in winter. So quite a good place to live, but a very simple place to construct in many ways, so long as you knew the properties of the natural properties of the stone occurring naturally in the geology of Nazareth.
In your archaeology of the site, did you find any locations of cooking?
Cooking. No, we didn't actually. Bear in mind, we came to the site after it had been excavated by somebody else, and much of the floor had been dug away. So only that one patch we saw in those slides had been preserved. Features that we might have hoped to find on the floor, like a hearth for cooking, maybe places for sitting, sleeping, and so forth, had all been destroyed before we got to it. So unfortunately, we could say a lot less about the house than we could have if the early 20th century excavators had not dug away all the evidence.
For the listening audience, what would be the waterfall in that area per year?
It's always said that the rainfall in the Nazareth area specifically is similar to that in London, in England, which is where I'm speaking to you from. In fact, I'm speaking to you in a rainstorm. I can hear rain pitter-pattering on the building that I'm in. So although it doesn't rain as much in England as people outside the UK think it does, it is quite rainy. And if it was that rainy in Nazareth, it's no wonder there were so many farms, because the soils are very good, and there would be the rain to water crops, grow grass for animals, that sort of thing.
In the vicinity of the residence,
Mm-hmm.
any indication of a water source? Now, I read your book, but for the listening audience, a water source.
From the first century, there is a natural spring at the Sisters of Nazareth site. Funnily enough, we were the first people to identify it as a natural spring. It had been thought to be an artificial cistern before we realized that it was bubbling up from the earth, and there wasn't any kind of conduit or piping or tunnel going into it. So it was a natural spring. There are a number of natural springs in the centre of Nazareth, as it exists today. One of them, Mary's Well, or sometimes called St Mary's Well, was probably outside the first century village. It was probably quite away from it. Now, that doesn't mean people from the village weren't using it. Often we find a well being used in the early Roman period, plainly, that was the well that people in a village were using. So that was physically separate from the village. So that's possibly a well for the village. There are two other known springs in the centre of Nazareth, and they would have provided the water needs for a small community. There are other springs on the hills around Nazareth in the valley, and in fact, the small settlements that we found in the survey on the Nazareth side of the valley follow the what's called the spring line, the piece of the hill which geologically produces springs, quite closely. So we know that people had access to water. The other way, of course, they had access to water is by collecting rainfall. And at least at some times of the year, if you collect rainfall in Galilee, you can actually fill quite substantial water cisterns, which can be dug easily in the natural limestone. So your water needs are pretty fulfilled by very simple measures: living close to a spring, collecting rainfall, and of course the fact that there was a wadi, a vadi, in the centre of Nazareth shows that there was a seasonal river going through the centre of Nazareth. So at some times in the year, at least, there was actual running water through the centre of Nazareth at the bottom of that steep slope that we saw on the slide there. Water is easy to come by, relatively speaking. Food is likely to have been plentiful because of the farming characteristics of the area. And although you wouldn't think it by going to the Nazareth area now, there's evidence that as late as the Ottoman period, the 19th century, there was quite a lot of timber in the Nazareth area. So there was quite a lot of wood. You could have things made out of wood, made out of leather, made out of pottery. Obviously, in the society of the first century, they knew about metalworking, iron, bronze, gold and silver. Many metals could be worked. So, and also we have evidence of weaving from both the Sisters of Nazareth site and an IAA, Israel Antiquities Authority, excavation quite close to the Sisters of Nazareth site, also probably dating from the first century. So weaving could produce clothes, bed throws, cushions, carpets, curtains for windows, and that sort of thing.
Okay, another question. Since it was a religious observant community, that's what you would say?
Yeah.
Any evidence of mikvahs, ritual baths?
No, that is a very interesting point. There are some other first century Jewish settlements without mikvahs. In those sites, it's been suggested by Israeli archaeologists that local people used natural springs or other water sources for ritual purification. The absence of mikvahs in Nazareth may be more apparent than genuine because we only have a very, very small amount of excavation, even today, within the centre of Nazareth, within the ancient settlement. So there could be all manner of stuff that mikvahs, storage facilities, open spaces, paved open spaces, various types of crafts working facilities waiting to be found. There could even be a synagogue building waiting to be found in the centre of Nazareth. But the likelihood is that those sort of archaeological features, if you like, will only emerge from rescue excavation, or some people say salvage excavation, when construction is taking place in Nazareth, in modern Nazareth. And that salvage excavation or rescue excavation will probably be done by the Israel Antiquities Authority, which has a very, very good rescue archaeology program. And in fact, when we were there, there was an important rescue dig in the centre of Nazareth. It's sometimes called the IMC site, the International Marian Centre site, which was an Israel Antiquities Authority rescue excavation, not very far from the Sisters of Nazareth site.
Another item that I could think of that would be of ritual use, and since the whole area is limestone, is the ritual limestone cups that the Jewish people would use.
Well, there are fragments of those from the Sisters of Nazareth site, from the Church of the Annunciation site. I think from the IMC site, but I'd have to check that.
Okay,
So yeah, there are those finds. There are some from the valley as well. There are fragments from sites which are ploughed. The pottery and stone objects get turned up by the plough, and we can record them in the soil.
Well, Professor, this has been a very interesting program. With what you said and your experience, it's adding a picture into my mind of Nazareth during the time period of Jesus, or Nazareth during the first century, Common Era, and maybe BC as well. And that we got timber. I never thought of that. We got farmland. Never thought of that. They were actually constructing part of their homes, or maybe all their homes. It looks like underground a little bit to stay cool and warm. So adding these things together, it does paint a more accurate interpretation of what was in my mind an hour ago of Nazareth. And also the idea that you said that they were seemingly excluded themselves from the Roman community at Sepphoris. I always thought the understanding would be that that's where they went for gainful employment. But now, in consideration, looks like possibly not. So within a little bit over an hour or so, I learned quite a bit, Professor, and I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you for giving me your time to listen to all this, and I hope it's been interesting for your audience.
Hopefully in the future you can be with us again.
I much enjoy that.